I believe every relationship begins with a question. And at Bank of the Ozarks, we love finding the answer. So when I tell my customers I can do something, I do it, and I get it done quickly. Bank of the Ozarks is one of the top-ranked banks in the country, but we still make decisions locally, face-to-face. You have a friend here. Bank of the Ozarks.
What a great opportunity to talk to the two of you here this morning, and really unique perspectives here that there aren't too many people in Arkansas who would have. Not only did you grow up during that civil rights era, during the time that the Civil Rights Act was passed in the 60s, and you were very integral in that civil rights movement, but you've also had successful careers since then, and you're very active in the African-American community today. So I guess the best place to start for me is as we look at this month being the 50-year anniversary of the signing of the Civil Rights Act back in 1964. What has been your perception of the way it has been remembered this month? Because as I got ready for this interview and looked over some of the things that have been said, some of the commemorations, I don't see a lot of media coverage about it. There's a little bit, but there hasn't been a whole lot. What's been your experience with looking at that?
It has not been a whole lot. I know that there were some events at the Mosaic Templars and a few tidbits around the state, but this was an historic time. And I think it was so historic because of the context of when it was signed. We're talking about after the March on Washington in '63. We're talking about after or during the period of Freedom Summer, which I think needs to be talked about more as well. And we're talking about after the assassination of the president and a new president coming in and having the guts to do something, especially a Southerner named Lyndon Johnson. And I think that historic context makes this worth applauding and should be commemorated more greatly than it is at this point.
Sherman, is it being talked about enough?
Scott, I don't think it is, but I think that is consistent with what we see and what we hear, and certainly what we have learned about this time in history and the conservative nature of the country in general. I just think that's one of the things that needs to be discussed at the national level, at the local level, certainly in the African American community, and voices need to be heard, and logic and reason needs to be put on the table with respect to next steps and how significant these past 50 years really have been and continue to be.
We hope that that's what we're doing here today. I know that my generation and even a generation past me now grew up at a time after that where things were not nearly as volatile and don't have a memory of that. And I think it's very important to bring that because we could lose that. When I was looking back at this and looking at the things that were going on, and when you talk about all white political primaries being held, when you talk about the segregation of the schools and the segregation of businesses, when you don't have a memory of that, it sounds like something that happened 200 years ago. I think that's important to point out that 50 years ago was not very long ago.
No. Not historically, it was not. And it wasn't just the businesses. It was walking into a store as a young girl and not being able to drink out of the water fountain that was so nice and shiny with the cold water. It was not being able to try on clothing in the stores or shoes. It was not being allowed to use the bathroom downtown. And so it was not being allowed to get on the buses. And I remember one of my earliest experiences was, as a kid, was getting on a bus, sitting about the third or fourth row, and the bus wouldn't take off. And my grandmother having to come to the front and remove my cousin and me from the front, and then the bus took off.
Did you have an understanding of why that was happening at that moment?
Not at that time, no. I didn't understand because I was relatively young.
Sure.
I understand it now. And I guess one of the things that I appreciated most at Hendrix was, even though the majority of students of African Americans could not try on the shoes, I don't think people understand those little things are just so important to make sure your shoe fits properly, to make sure your dress fits properly, to be able to go into the lobby of the theater. Those are little things, but they mean so very, very much. Hendrix went out of its way to make sure that Emily Johnson and I, who desegregated the institution, could go where any other white students could go, but the vast majority of African Americans could not. And so that was an evolutionary period and something that it's still indelibly imprinted in my mind, and I don't leave home without going to the bathroom. It's just a part of, I think, a culture that I grew up with, knowing that it wasn't going to happen for me if something happened in that way. So these are things that are very, very small and don't seem like huge things and that we take for granted, but they were not things that we could take for granted during that time, because our lives were on the line if we did not follow the customs of the day. And I think you need to understand that Emmett Till was killed during this period, supposedly for whistling at somebody, or the young men Goodman, Cheney, Swerner killed for just simply wanting to vote or register folks to vote. So we think it's a long time ago, but it's just like yesterday, especially for those of us who grew up during that era.
Are there some things in your mind and your memory that feel just like yesterday?
Absolutely. I remember growing up, of course, in Phillips County, coming to Little Rock to attend Philander Smith College as a freshman, and it was a happy time. And I tell folks, and they seem to be surprised, but I grew up in a strong nuclear family where my mother was the education proponent. She taught me to read, write, and do my multiplication tables before I entered the first grade. And my dad taught me my work ethic. Fast forward, I come to Little Rock, I'm a happy kid, and I'm on the campus of Philander Smith College, and some members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, were on campus from time to time, and they started to talk to us, and I was totally shocked to find out that we as African American students could not go to the state capital of this state and go into the basement, into the cafeteria and eat. They wouldn't let us in. So we organized with the help of the SNCC, and we marched from Philander's campus, which is 6-7 blocks at the most from the state capitol. We go down in the basement and to be met by a platoon of the largest state troopers I think I'd ever seen on the stairs, and we sang "We Shall Overcome," at which, you know, after which we were told we better remove ourselves from the Capitol. And we had been coached, and we were smart enough not to become emotionally charged to the extent that we said or did anything that would give them reason to start whipping people. And a couple of people actually did get beat, one of which was a white guy named Howard Hanson. Himmelbun. Howard Himmelbun.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for correcting.
And this is the same, roughly the same time as the passage of the Civil Rights Act, right?
Yeah,
So it's
this
important.
this was the early part of,
Yeah.
of 1964.
Yeah, so that's important for me too, is that it didn't just all of a sudden ease over just because the legalities were there. I mean, the Civil Rights era began before 64 and it continued after 64.
That's exactly right.
After the Civil Rights Act was passed, that 2 weeks later, the bombing of the Birmingham church, where the 4 young ladies were killed, it's still indelibly imprinted in my mind simply because one of the ministers in the Church of God, which was our church, had a granddaughter who was one of the 4 who was killed. So these things are very, very much alive in our memories, because you had the height of it, and well, that was in '63. That was the height, the "I Have a Dream" speech. We had moved forward. But then you still had the March on Selma. You still had individuals trying to register to vote. Arkansas did not have the voting problem that other states had with the literacy test and the grandfather clause. If your grandfather couldn't vote, then you couldn't vote. But Arkansas cost a poll tax, and people had to decide between paying that poll tax sometimes and food, because bread was like 10, 15 cents. It would have been a meal for a family. And my folks always decided to vote. And that's why voting is so important, and it's still a part of the conversation today. Even though we had the Voting Rights Act of '65, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, we've had all of these civil rights acts that have been passed, most of them dealing with the simple right to be able to go where you want to go, own your own property, to be able to vote, and to get a quality education. Those things are still on the table, still being debated today. We still have not resolved it.
Did the Civil Rights Act give it legs at all, or was it something that had maybe gotten to the point that was unstoppable at that point anyway? You talked about the sit-in, and I think about the desegregation of Central High and all the fear that must have been in your daily lives, as you already talked about this morning. Did that give you some more confidence? Did that bolster you?
The quick answer is yes, it did. But if I can, let me
Sure.
finish my historical overview of what happened with the cafeteria. First day we failed, and we turned around and we went back to campus and we reorganized, and the news media was all over it. And that evening I was in the dormitory, and the phones rang as they normally do in the dormitory, and somebody called my name out, and I ran down the hall, not thinking it was who it was. I was thinking and hoping it was someone over in the ladies' dorm that was calling me, and it was my mother, who was sitting in Marvel, Arkansas, and watching the news, and she was frightened to death. And she made me promise that I would not go back down there the next day for fear of my getting hurt. And I promised her that I wouldn't. And the very next day, we all went back. And we failed the second day. But the third day, we got in, and we were served, and we ate. And yes, when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed, you know, one of the things it did, it mandated access to facilities and schools. I mean, you know, you couldn't discriminate, or you weren't supposed to discriminate. And so that slowly started a cascade of changes that carried forth. And there was a period of time, in my opinion, maybe 6, 7, maybe 10 years subsequent to the signing of that act, when the things that people needed to do, like Senator Chesterfield is talking about, access to anywhere, it was commonplace. It was not unusual. Voting wasn't unusual. To not have access to the cafeteria in the Capitol when my parents were taxpayers. They were not on any kind of government subsistence program. They were taxpayers. That was absolutely ludicrous to me. I didn't understand that. That was as much our capital as it was anybody else's. So that was a huge victory for those of us that went down there. And so I've seen from there a lot of changes that I think have taken place that has gotten us to where we are. But as I stated earlier, the conservativeness of the country in general and people, even here in Arkansas, seems to be trying to push back the history and push us back to a time when we would have great difficulty voting, when we would not have the ability to go to school really where we wanted to go to school. And that's a whole different issue, which we can talk about.
Yeah.
But if you look at schools, you know, they are effectively, and have been, and Senator can speak to this much more eloquently than I can, but they're effectively being segregated. So we went through a period of time where a lot of changes made, and now I'm nervous that I see a tremendous effort to try to roll back the pages of history.
Let's go to today then, and let's talk about that. And we'll start with education. You're a retired educator, and you've been in the classroom for much of your life. Both of you, successes in your career. Talk about what do you think about when you see young African Americans today growing up in the 21st century? Certainly, they are afforded much more opportunities than the two of you were. But let's talk about the policies. Is it a policy-driven issue for you that you think that's being effectively scaling back some of the movements of the 60s, or is there something else?
I think there are several things that are going on right now. When Mr. Tate and I were in high school, all of our teachers looked like us, and they lived in the community. It doesn't mean today that all teachers have to look alike, but our teachers were part of our community. Many times the teachers in the classrooms today leave the school and go back to communities that have nothing to do with those children. I think sometimes that if we had more people who were educated living among parents going to churches sometimes with those kids, it would make a difference. But I think the greatest difference is expectation. I was expected to learn. Nobody looked at me and decided that I couldn't learn. And if I didn't do as I was supposed to, there was a connectivity between parents and the teachers. There was no questioning the authority. And I'm not saying that people should not question teachers, but there's got to be a redevelopment of that relationship between the parent and the teacher that I'm seeing missing right now. There is distrust between both groups. And we've got to make sure that those persons who are in the classroom have a positive discipline model. We've got to make sure that those individuals in the classroom understand that all children can learn. I was expected to learn, and we had everything going against us that they say today is the reason kids can't learn. We didn't have much money. So today, lower socioeconomic status is supposed to mean that you can't learn. I don't believe that. I came from a single parent home. He came from a dual parent home. That's supposed to preclude you learning, and yet I was one of the nation's first national achievement finalists. It doesn't mean that. It means that parents and teachers and administrators must demand greatness of our children and look at them and feel that they can learn, and then the resources must be there. We're taking valuable resources out of our schools each and every day, and we are saying to parents across the state that there's something wrong with public education. I think public education is still the greatest hope that we have, because all the kids are not going to get into charter schools or private schools. We've got to make sure that every school is a school of choice, and that's what I've dedicated my life to doing, and I'm going to continue to fight for as we go forward. And the more kids know about their history, you see, when I go in and I do Black history programs, kids begin to sit up a little bit more straight because they don't have a clue about their history. We're only teaching European history. And that is not going to get it, because even though we had the Moors and we had Pushkin in Russia, nobody talks about the African American authors very much, other than those who write about the seamy stuff today. But we're talking about going back a long way and talking about the inventors and talking about the STEM folks, the science, the technology, the engineering, and the math that was developed because of African Americans. We've got to instill that history in all of our children, not just African Americans, so that people have an appreciation of the contributions of everybody in this society.
Ms. Sherman, you mentioned and used the word effort to resegregate schools. What is the origination of that? Where do you think that's happening?
Well, here's what I see. Even if you look at the United States Supreme Court, it is a very conservative-minded court. Look at some of the recent rulings that they've made, and they are actually considering, as we speak, appealing or repealing the Civil Rights Act. There's a suggestion and a notion that we have reached a state of equality that no longer demands or requires all of these laws, that all of a sudden man is so good-hearted and good-natured that we're going to go forth and do all of the right things because we know it's the right thing to do. Well, and you come down to the states and look at what is going on in our general assemblies, not just in Arkansas, but across the country, with respect to voting and voting rights and requirements that folk will have to go through in order to vote. You look at what is being allowed to happen with a lot of schools that are being allowed to be open and built in areas where there is predominantly a white population, very few African Americans, and the busing as we once knew it won't get them there. And those schools have, if you look at them, they tend to have better resources, better everything. That's what we fought against in the 60s. I remember when I was in high school, the only time we got new books was when the school across town ordered their new ones and we got their hand-me-downs. Now, one of the huge differences that I see also is when I came along and when the senator came along, she's absolutely right. It didn't matter whether you were coming from a single-family home or a home where you had a mom and a dad. What mattered, the overwhelming majority of the folks in that time understood clearly from whence we had come, and they knew the ticket was to get out was education. There was never any doubt that Sherman Tate was going to go to college. The only question was where I would end up going. I mean, my mom made that clear, and I wanted to go. I wanted to go. It was never a question. My teachers made us believe that we could do it, and that's a big part of it. George McKenna, who was a noted high school principal in inner city Los Angeles, said something. We brought him to Little Rock. This was years ago. I think I was with the Chamber of Commerce. So it was '89 when I was chairman of the Chamber of Commerce. He said something that has resonated and stayed with me down through the years, because it's true. He said, children don't necessarily care how much you know, but they always know how much you care. And once they understand that you care, behavior changes. Once they understand that there are expectations, there are standards, you know, there are requirements, they'll start to rise to those expectations and standards. But if no one ever gives them that challenge and that push and support, it's very difficult to get them there.
I'm only on page 2, but they're giving me a wrap here. This went by so fast. Thank you very much for your perspectives.
Oh, thank you for having us here and for doing this program. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Time did go fast.